welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Karen Greenberg. I'm the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham Law, and I've been asked to moderate today's discussion. We're going to start very quickly because we have a hard deadline of 8:50, and so we're going to, that's what I was told. So we're going to hopefully live up to it, but maybe not, but we'll get very close to that. So I'm going to start with you, Alex. I don't think you need an introduction, but I'll give you, you've been making films for quite a while. They're all a little scary, but this is by far the scariest. By way of background, you sort of got into the national security post 9/11 business with Taxi to the Dark Side, which won the Academy Award. You've gone on to do a number of things that are national security related, but to break it up, you've done a Steve Jobs movie, a Scientology movie, a James Brown movie, Frank Sinatra. I mean, you know, so there's, I just want people to know that you have a lighter side, because that's very, very important. But I want to ask you a few questions about this movie, and then we'll move on to the discussion. And that is that I remember talking to you in the early days of you couldn't have possibly known where this film was going to go. And so I guess when did you realize that you were really in territory that was dependent on leaks, that was going to reveal something that the intelligence community doesn't want revealed, and probably that the American public doesn't really want to know about on some very deep level? When did you realize, at what point, that you were in a story that was really quite disturbing on rather profound levels? And just, how did that happen?
Well, it happened early on. It seemed like an interesting enough story to get involved with. It had been reported by the time we started, and it had been reported back in, it had been discovered back in 2010, and David Sanger, I believe, wrote his piece in 2012. So it seemed like the kernel of a really good story, but the challenges in terms of telling it were really daunting, and nobody wanted to talk. And I was really surprised. Even friends of mine who had come out of the Obama administration didn't even really want to talk to me off the record for fear of being prosecuted. So it really was daunting. And then we had a view that we also had a problem in terms of what to show. So it was scary for a long time. I didn't know whether we had a film.
Right, and you know, the moment of this film, and I've seen this film a number of times now, when you get to the point in the film where you talk about they talk about Nitro Zeus, is that what it is? Nitro Zeus?
Nitro Zeus.
Whoa, you realize that there are levels to this story we're never going to know. And so I guess the question is, do you have a sense, you know, Richard Clarke, right, who's featured prominently in the movie, wrote a book about cyber war several years ago. We're going to talk about Fred's book in a minute. Are we in a latent war? Did we have the way your movie tells it, we sort of were at war and now we've receded from war after Obama's pact with Iran. I mean, where do you see this in terms of cyber war? Are we there or not?
Well, I guess we are in a kind of latent possibility for war. I think that, Fred will talk about some of the early days as we got into this, but one of the things that I discovered, we discovered in the process of doing this film, we discovered Nitro Zeus, where the science fiction cyber scenario was here recently, in December, I believe. A rather large part of the Ukrainian grid went down, most certainly probably due to a piece of Russian malware. And my friends at Symantec, Eric and Liam, noted that when they were working on Stuxnet in 2010, they saw maybe one other piece of malware that originated from a nation-state actor. Now they're following well over 100. And this is, and these are things that are implants that are crisscrossing, that are active. So it's becoming more and more terrifying, precisely because the number and the size of the weapons are increasing, even as the secrecy continues.
Okay, one more question about Obama. You know, the film would have looked different if Obama hadn't decided to make this pact. It would have had a very different impact. Were you surprised that this diplomatic solution, this treaty occurred, given what you were seeing as you followed the story?
I guess so. I mean, Obama is a kind of confounding figure. Here's a guy, as you know, from having written your wonderful book, who has shredded the envelope when it comes to the rule of law in terms of using drones and actually even with cyber weapons. Yet at the same time, he is engaged with other countries in ways that are surprising. Though I think what surprised me about this film was it kind of shows both sides of Obama. The Obama who really wants to make a deal with Iran and believes that that's the important and vital way to go, yet at the same time has in his back pocket a very powerful and ruthless weapon that I think he's prepared to use if Iran cheats. So there's an aspect of Obama that's extremely steel-eyed, even though he's been portrayed as weak in terms of engaging in this treaty. So it was that double-sided character to Obama that I found interesting in pursuing this, because he went much further on cyber warfare than Bush was willing to go. And I think to some extent that may account for why Michael Hayden was willing to talk about some things with a wink and a nod, feeling that it was Obama who crossed the Rubicon, not Bush.
Yeah, I think that's right. So let's try to bring in the rest of our panelists. Fred, very nice to have you here. I'm sure you're known to this audience, but let me just say a few words about your stellar career. You just wrote a book, Dark Territory, the story of cyber war. Is that the history of
Secret
history of cyber war? Sorry. You write a weekly column for Slate on war stories. But your background is good. Your background is particularly strong, not just in cyber, but in the nuclear conversation and political strategy towards the nuclear conversation. So I'm going to sort of begin at the end, which is following up from what Alex just said, which is given your background in nuclear disarmament, nuclear politics, nuclear strategy, and Alex's film where they sort of combine, you know, cyber war and nuclear disaster. How do you see Obama's role in this, in what he affected with this Iranian deal? And is it the beginning, do you think, of a new regulatory world order? Or do you think it's the story that Alex tells for most of his film, which is just a hidden war that's going to get more and more powerful? Which of these things do you think is the likely scenarios?
Well, I don't really see a contradiction here. I've always seen Obama as a realist, fundamentally, with a capital R. He's willing to use certain weapons in the national interest as he sees it if they don't involve large commitments of troops or resources, to wit, drones and cyber war. At the same time, he's always looking for a diplomatic deal to solve the problem. I don't see those two things as necessarily in contradiction to one another. I think they're all to the same end. One thing that I think, actually it's very curious, I mean, we worked on these projects independently. I did talk sometimes with your associate producer, but we were both well along in it by that time. But it ends really on the same note, which is that we have right now, you know, there's this U.S. Cyber Command. This is not a paper tiger thing. They have war plans. They have target sets. It is a combatant command. They have relationships with all the other combatant commands, Central Command, Europe Command, so forth. There are plans for every contingency that involve a cyber element. And yet, as Dick Clark was saying, nobody has thought through any of this because it has always been so secretive. There is right now a Defense Science Board panel in the Pentagon that is working on a paper on cyber deterrence. What is it? Nobody knows. Nobody knows what it is. Not in the early 60s, but by 1945, in the fall, there were economists and political scientists thinking about this nuclear bomb that had just blown up. And how does this change things, or does it change things? Is this a new kind of weapon? Is it just a larger weapon? Can we use it in any kind of thing? And so if it's not just another weapon, but something completely different, how do we prevent its use? And people started thinking about this months after the nuclear weapon went off. Cyber has been around actually much earlier than this film suggests. The concept of computer network attack was codified in the early 90s. There are instances of its use, and yet we are just now beginning to think about the most basic questions that should have been propelling the weapon itself, but the technology came first, and the policy is way behind, and everybody is in way over their heads. And this is acknowledged to me by people who have been intimately involved in this for decades.
We're in way over our heads because we don't know what destruction it can cause?
Well, because everybody has this now. There are 20 nations that have armies with a cyber unit, some less capable than others. We are living in cyber terms, a very glass house. As this film points out, everything is plugged in. It wouldn't take a lot to do extensive damage to our entire society. The military, something that's not in my book because I learned about it after the fact, but is telling, is that the Navy is now training its people on ships to use a sextant again for navigating by the stars. Yes, because they figure, not just in case, but they assume that in the event of a war, the data link with the GPS satellite is going to be disrupted. Yeah. Maybe not for a long time, but enough for the ship doesn't know where it is.
That's awesome.
And there are other things like this going on in the Air Force as well, not so much in the Army, which has always been a bit behind in this. But the point is, the military is, all of our qualitative advantage in the military is based on things that plug into computer networks. All of our critical infrastructure. 25 years ago, everybody thought, this is great, let's plug into the internet, and it makes sense. They didn't know that they were getting into an inherently vulnerable situation. And now other countries, this isn't the Manhattan Project. You don't need a campus full of brilliant physicists and billions of dollars to do this. You need a room full of computers and some people who have been trained how to use them. The NSA used to have kind of a monopoly in this, and not at all anymore.
And we're going to get to that because there's one part of the film where you bring up the private sector and then you just kind of let it go. You don't play that out. But the private sector's role in all of this, and you talk about how they deferred to the private sector, Obama, to sort of let them work out the responses. But this is do you see that as one of the more complicated pieces of maybe your next film? Like, where is the private sector in this? And I'm asking this to all of you. Where is the private sector in this? Maybe Ian, wait, let me introduce you. Ian Wallace, who we've worked together many times. He is the co-director of the cybersecurity program at New America, which is hosting tonight's event. But he's had so many different iterations. He worked at Brookings, he worked for the British Embassy, he was at Harvard for a while, and you've kind of been thinking about this for a very long time. So maybe you should pick up this part of the thread.
So I was glad you mentioned the private sector, because I wanted to pick up on that and generally push back against the idea that all the knowledge sits with the government, and particularly the US government, and if only they would let it out, then we could have a proper debate. And I think what elements of that are true, and certainly how the US government thinks about this is an important part of how the US government is going to use these capabilities, and that has an impact on wider policy. But I also think that these conversations are beginning to happen, and what Alex's film brought out, I think, very well, is the increasing power of non-state actors, companies like Symantec, like Kaspersky, like Ralph's firm, and the fact that these conversations don't need governments in order to take place. They will be better conversations if they take account of what governments think and what governments are doing, but we shouldn't, we're in some ways in danger of thinking in 20th century terms if we think about nuclear weapons which are only held by governments, which is, you know, I see exactly where the idea about openness is coming from, but I also think that there are new possibilities with the fact that a lot of the knowledge and indeed a lot of the expertise to defend against malicious use of this capability actually sits in the private sector.
Well, so how does that happen? So the private sector develops this information, and then do they feel compelled to share it with the government? Do they? How does that work?
Well, I think what we're seeing now is, you know, companies like Symantec and others are slowly coming to terms with the slightly ambivalent position they have. You know, their job is to defend their customers and highlight bad things are going on, while at the same time other people are using these capabilities, at least in their own minds, to pursue sort of noble ends. And I think we're in, you know, as was mentioned, at the dawn of a new era, and how that's going to shake down, I think, is going to take time to work through.
But there's another kind of private sector enterprise whose names are much less well known, which is in the business of zero-day exploits that make a lot of money, sometimes from our own government, which has bounty programs, and from companies like Microsoft, which has extensive bounty programs. Curiously, Apple does not.
So explain to the audience
what they do.
These are.
It's people, some of whom used to work in the NSA or Unit 8200, who spend their days looking for vulnerabilities in computer systems that have never been discovered before. And then they go to the company or they go to the government and they say, we've discovered a flaw in your operating system or your whatever it is, and they say, well, thank you very much. Here's $100,000 for discovering that, because I'd rather that you discover it and tell me about it than that China discovers it and doesn't tell me about it and gets inside for months or years. This is now, you know, hacker used to be a nasty term in government circles. It is not any longer. A certain kind of hacker is welcome into the dialogue. The NSA is seeking to employ more of these people or to have contractual arrangements with. So, but in terms of what, now not all these zero-day exploit companies are good guys. Some of them help criminal organizations. Some of them help foreign intelligence agencies. So you do have people like Symantec and Kaspersky, although Kaspersky's status is a little ambiguous, but you have them protecting systems. Yet you also have other private industries that are looking for flaws, sometimes for the benefit of what we would see as good, and sometimes not so much.
Well, that's kind of how the film begins, with this kind of sort of like detective story of, you know, what were they going to find out in this, you know, kind of world? What pattern were they going to discover? What, you know, I mean, this is a whole other way of thinking about the world than maybe I was brought up with. And so it's so I just wanted to bring out the private sector thing. Ian, I just want to ask you one more thing about, you've heard both of them talk about Obama. Just in terms of Obama and the role he's playing in this, do you think, given that he's a sort of a 20th century person, in the way you've just referred to a 20th century person, who believes very much in diplomacy, believes very much in secrecy, and I think that's one of the strong points of the film, is to show just how much the secrecy of the Obama administration, how important it's been. Do you see him as carving a path towards the future with the way he's done this, or sort of being naive and idealistic in his own peculiar way?
I think the former. I mean, I think two things. One, the common thread that runs through, you know, how you describe it, the sort of two sides of Obama, is his determination to avoid a bloody war in the Middle East. And that what Stuxnet provided was the opportunity to do that, to put more time on the clock until you could get to the point, potentially, of bringing Iran to the negotiating table. So I think you can see a connection between the two, and at least at that level, I think you can make a case that Stuxnet was successful. In terms of the sort of wider question of whether Obama was sort of devious or naive, I mean, I think you know this better than I do, that there's a sort of strong sense of kind of a strong legal strand in his thinking, and that comes down to people have to obey the law about not leaking. And one of the problems in this space is we haven't quite worked out where that dividing line is, in large measure because there has to be at least some secrecy in order to properly engage in cyber capabilities, because unless you're in the other guy's system, you don't have a capability. And being in another guy's system depends on a certain amount of secrecy and, at the very least, doubt. And so it's finding this balance. And I think there are people in the intelligence community, you heard Mike Hayden, he wouldn't have said that if he didn't believe that others felt the same way, I think, that are beginning to think that there needs to be a conversation. The British government is starting to talk about offensive capability. Other governments are beginning to get there. But there has to be a line. And you know, I think it was actually mentioned by someone in the movie, Gary Brown, in fact, no one's quite sure where that line is, and until they are, they don't want to get remotely close to it because that could leave them in jail.
No, I mean, in the Obama administration, around when he first came in, there was some movement within the intelligence agencies to start acknowledging that we had this offensive capability. And then Obama went public in denouncing China for cyber attacks into us, and this was shut down. Panetta, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, said, the Air Force was about to put out a paper on this, and he said, we're not putting out this paper because it might make the president look hypocritical. Now, the kinds of cyber offensive operations that we do are different from what China, you know, we don't need to steal Chinese industrial secrets because they're stealing them from us, so, you know, we're way ahead of them. But we're in their networks, we're in their military networks, we're in their critical infrastructure networks. In some ways, it could be rationalized as espionage. You know, you have an agent on the ground. We have a bug in their network. But the difference is this, that, and Hayden says this, that the technology involved, the personnel involved, the facility involved in doing this offense and espionage is the same. And once you're in a network, you can mess with the network. You can destroy, disrupt, distort. And so this would be like your agent in the field has a mini nuke in his backpack. I mean, he is a potential saboteur as well as a spy. And so we are created by being in each other's networks. In some ways, it's secure. We see what they're doing. We can see if they're planning an attack. On the other hand, we're about to have a big crisis someplace, and each side knows that he could gain an immense advantage by launching an attack on the cyber networks before the other guy does. There's actually an incentive to do so.
Yeah, and this is the technical story, but there's also the knotty problem of the law and norms of behavior, and Gary Brown talks about that in the film, but a recent development that was quite interesting, which was the Department of Justice recently charged certain individuals in Iran for their attack on the U.S. banks. It'd be hard to understand why Iran, if they could identify a number of individuals in the NSA, wouldn't charge them for Stuxnet, an attack on critical infrastructure in time of peace. So that's where you get into the area of unintended consequences. I believe that the idea of Stuxnet, whether it was to slow down the Iranians or whether it was to slow down the Israelis, you know, technically it was a good idea, but what it set in motion were a series of permitted behaviors that now are kind of running out of control because there is no sense of a larger sense of either diplomatic or legal norm.
So I think that Norm's point is really important. But I would also push back slightly on the idea that Stuxnet was the single act that led to everything that's happened since. I think it maybe lifted the lid on some activities that a number of different countries around the world had the capability to sort of take forward, and it potentially legitimated some behavior in the minds of others. But I also think that if the old, and this is I think where Obama was when he was thinking this through and inheriting this program from President Bush, if the alternative was the Israelis kicking off an unwanted war in the Middle East, this may be one of those rare instances where potentially setting those events in train was the lesser of two evils.
Well, these issues are complicated, and that's why I thought it was worth telling the story, because it goes beyond that, and I think that goes very much to the issue of why there was a dispute between the United States and Israel in terms of how aggressive the worm should be. And it's interesting when you have a shared technology, but each side can do what it wants with the technology, even though one side desperately doesn't want the other to do it. It starts to create real problems that are full of unanticipated consequences. The other thing that was interesting that we didn't put into the film as a technical matter was there was a version of the Stuxnet worm that did get out prior to this one, and there was a remediation program put in place by the NSA to basically find all the IP addresses where it had spread and clean it up off those systems. They knew how quickly it would spread, and so that they were even more assiduous about insisting that the Israelis not pursue a more aggressive option, which of course they went and did.
Alex, one last question for you, and I think we don't have a lot of time left, but we have some. And that is that, there's a lot of sort of, Cassandra's box that we've opened up here, and we're never going to be able to put it back. And there are people like Richard Clark who, in a very calm way in your film, sort of lets us know just how bad this can be. And my question to you is your sense from talking to Michael Hayden and all these other individuals, from Hayden to Clark to others, is your sense that there's a sense of panic within the government, or is there a sense of a sort of complacency, we'll get through this like we've gotten through other things? Just what's the vibe there?
The vibe we found was slightly different between the military folks and, let's call them, the hackers inside the NSA. And the military folks believe that I don't want to generalize about everybody, but just in terms of a number of people we talked to, if you talk to Mike Hayden, he will say, look, yes, the potential of these weapons is enormous, but it's not like we're dropping a bomb on Hiroshima. That's and as a military man, I'm thinking about ordnance and explosions and people dying and incinerated in fire. And yet, to the hackers inside the NSA, the military folks don't have a full enough appreciation of the kind of technological damage that these things can do, and the systems. Like the source says, it's Humpty Dumpty. So I think there's a bit of a division there, but I don't sense panic.
Yeah, and that comes across in your. Did you want to disagree with that?
No, but this has been going on for a long time. It's beginning in the early 1980s. There were people within the government who were concerned about this. And they would get other people concerned, and there would be a very high-level thing, and then a new administration would come in, and nobody knew anything about it. And the same people would try to get them all excited, and it would happen, and then it would go down again. I think we're now in kind of a permanent state of at least awareness of what is at least potentially a major problem, and you have executive orders and things like that. But one problem, at least in the United States, is that 90% of these networks are owned by private companies, including through which a lot of classified things happen. And they have always resisted any kind of regulation, mandatory security requirements, separate internet channels, which Dick Clark, when he worked in the Clinton administration, tried to get through. They've resisted it. Economic advisors have resisted it. And now, you know, what Chris Inglis was saying, who actually is a very straightforward guy, the former deputy director of the NSA, that the military is pretty good in terms of cutting off its gates, even though you still find intruders inside. That's because over the years, the Defense Department, all the military, there are now only 8 intersections between military communication channels and the overall internet. Just 8. So you could have the NSA sitting on those 8 intersections and blocking most of what happens. In the rest of the country, civilian government, private industry, there are thousands. They're uncountable.
Yeah. Let me just say one thing, which is that the porousness between the government and the private sector when it comes, you know, you leave your government job and you go into a cyber industry somewhere. So it's not, that's also another piece of it. You can do your next movie.
Well, there are a number of people from Unit 8200 who've just started a company whose goal is to protect people against having their cars being hacked so they can be driven by remote control.
Yeah. Well, on that lovely note, I'm so sorry that we didn't have more time, but this is a remarkable film. And I mean, I love all your films, but this one just blew me away. So I'm sure others have had the same response. My takeaway from the night is the best one, is that when we're 80 and 90, they're going to really need us to teach them how to use all these mechanical instruments. So that's, you know, just as a safety precaution. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, gentlemen.